We'll come back here in Genesis chapter 47, and we're going to see the famine in Egypt. And the famine started from the outskirts of Egypt and went into Egypt. Despite the preparation, the famine was more grievous that it consumed the entire place of Egypt. And we're going to see Joseph is the millennial man sent by God for such a time as this. And for those that are searching for economic solutions, and here is the right chapter. See, the economic solution in Egypt in times of crisis is to uphold the dignity of the citizens there. And that's what this man did. And we're going to look at it from, just want to point something out in Genesis chapter 47, verse 18. He says, when that year was ended, that they came unto him the second year and said unto him, we will not hide it from my Lord, how that our money is spent. My Lord also had our herds of cattle. There is not aught left in the sight of my Lord, but our bodies and our lands. And how can Joseph resolve this problem? I mean, this is a critical issue here, that these people have lost everything. Now they're trying to offer themselves as slaves. And we're going to also see the culmination of the two economic systems. You have the world economic, and you have the Abrahamic blessing. And also we're going to see the final wish of Jacob, the patriarch. And we're going to see it here in Genesis chapter 47. And we begin here in Genesis chapter 47, verses 1. It says, and then Joseph came and told Pharaoh and said, my father and my brethren and their flocks and their herds and all they have are come in out of the land of Canaan, and behold, they are in the land of Goshen. Verse 2, it says, and he took some of his brethren, even 5 men, and presented them unto Pharaoh. Now Joseph told Pharaoh about their father and their brother now coming to Goshen. See, Jacob never came down to Egypt, but here he went to Goshen, but just Joseph took some of his brethren, and five of them to be precise, and presented them to Pharaoh. And in verse 3 it says, and Pharaoh said unto his brethren, what is your occupation? And they said unto Pharaoh, thy servants are shepherds, both we and also our fathers. There said moreover unto Pharaoh, for to sojourn in the land are we come, for thy servants have no pasture for their flocks, for the famine is sore in the land of Canaan. Now therefore we pray thee, let thy servants dwell in the land of Goshen. Pharaoh asked them, what is their occupation? And they said that they are shepherds. And shepherds then, they have, Egyptians don't have any concern about shepherds, nor do Pharaoh. And Egypt was a commercial city, and it was an industrial city, but the shepherds, they were not there. But here you have the famine, even in the land of Canaan, even in the land of Canaan and Egypt, the famine has consumed everything. So the only option for them was to go to this land called Goshen. And then Pharaoh told them there's no pasture. They told Pharaoh there's no pasture because of the famine, and they needed to stay in the land of Goshen. And here it says in the beginning, and Pharaoh spake unto Joseph, saying, thy father and thy brethren are come unto thee. The land of Egypt is before thee. In the best of the land make thy father and brethren to dwell. In the land of Goshen let them dwell. And if thou knowest any man of activity among them, then make them rulers of my cattle. Now Pharaoh says to Joseph now, take care of your father and your brethren, and that they are to dwell in the land of Goshen. Gives them permission, you see. But he says the best man is to also rule my cattle. And verse 7 it says, and Joseph brought in Jacob, his father, and set him before Pharaoh. And Jacob blessed Pharaoh. Again, here you notice that he brought in, after these 5 men have, Joseph has brought his brethren, 5 men of them have came to Pharaoh. But then here it seems like Jacob kind of like tag along. Well, he didn't go there directly, but somehow he came and meets Pharaoh. And you can see that he's not moving as fast as he was before. But of course, he's old, and now he's now crippled, and he's not going as fast. And but here, Jacob is positioned here to bless Pharaoh, because he has the power of blessing. He's a patriarch, you see, and he's to bless them, and then still God is able to elevate him in that position to bless a king, a place of honor. Despite all things that happen, God is still using this man to be a blessing to others. And then here it says in verse 8, it says, and Pharaoh said unto Jacob, how old art thou? And Jacob said unto Pharaoh, the days of the years of my pilgrimage are 130 years. Few and evil have the days of the years of my life been, and have not attained unto the days of the years of the life of my fathers in the days of their pilgrimage. Now, Pharaoh, after he has blessed Pharaoh, Pharaoh now asks Jacob, how old art thou? Because he apparently sees that he's an old man, and Jacob replied and said that I am 130 years old, but few years, and my years are few but evil. See, Jacob calls his days few and evil, and this man has had a troublous life. He has been too much trouble, and everything has happened to him because of his ways most of the time. But here, yet blessed by the promises. You see, he was blessed by the promises of God. This man is walking in God's power, and despite all the things that happened to him, he's still able to draw some influence to Pharaoh, in order to bless him. But he says, my days are not compared to my fathers. He said, my days are not compared to my fathers in the day of their pilgrimage. Now, these are the days of their earthly journey, Abraham and Isaac, the days of their pilgrimage, their time of journey with God. And the word pilgrimage here is margo. It's a Hebrew word in the sense of lodging a temporary abode, by extension of a permanent residence. And Abraham and Isaac were pilgrims, you see. These were, they were travelers. They were not lodgers or wanderers. They didn't wander around the earth. They didn't lodge in this place to make them feel comfortable. Pilgrims know where they are going. And Abraham and Isaac, they had a destination in mind. You see, all were looking towards the place of God in the afterlife. And that's what these men were doing. And sometimes this prosperity gospel fail to teach us that, or they miss the doctrine alone concerning Abraham, because Abraham was a pilgrim. He was not looking towards staying here and getting rich. He was moving ahead, and he was almost like a nomad. It's very important to realize that Abraham was not comfortable down here. You see, he lived as a pilgrim and a nomad, and they were moving from one place to the other, from one tent to the other. And as a reference in Hebrews 11 verses 9, it says, by faith he sojourned, speaking of Abraham, by faith he sojourned in the land of promise, as in a strange country, dwelling in tabernacle with Isaac and Jacob, heirs with him of the same promises. Now here it says, this is his perspective. He says, and he looked for a city which had foundation, whose builder and maker was God. In other words, Abraham was looking for a city which had a foundation. He'd never had a foundation here on earth, but he was looking for a city which had a foundation. You see, Abraham did not make this place as a place of foundation. He was a pilgrim. And it's very important for Christians, believers, to recognize that, because it can be misquoted that Abraham was a person who just stayed in this earth and got comfortable with money and all these things. No, he was a pilgrim looking for a foundation. Just like we are looking for a foundation. You see, Christ is our foundation. We are looking forward towards the heaven. And this man is looking for a foundation whose builder and maker was God. And again, the world is not our home, and we are all pilgrims down here. And every child of God are travelers. We are journeymen. That's what we are. Our home is in heaven. We have a heavenly, we have to have a heavenly mindset and heaven to gain. You see, we have to walk in the ways of God and walk in the ways of Christ. You see, because Job 14:1, our days are not plenty. Our days are very few. If Job 14:1 says again, it says, man born of a woman is of few days and full of trouble. And we know that our days are short, and we have to live as travelers, you see, down here. Not to say that we don't care about the earth or anything that goes on, because that can be some kind of mysticism, thinking that we have to look up to heaven all the time. No, we have to do the work here, but also have a heavenly mindset. You see, also in Psalm 39 verses 12, it says, hear my prayer, O Lord, give ear unto my cry. Hold not thy peace at my tears, for I am a stranger with thee, and a sojourner, as all my fathers were. See, all the fathers were sojourners. They are sojourners on earth. And again, it says, they were looking, Abraham had all the patriarchs were looking for a home. The Old Testament saints were looking for their earthly Jerusalem. And in the millennial kingdom, this is going to come to pass, and it's going to be a new heaven and new earth. But eyes were fixated on the afterlife, or what is going to come. And you see, and if you also read in Hebrews 11 verse 13, it says, these all died in faith, not having received the promise, but having seen them afar off, and were persuaded of them, and embraced them, and confessed that they were strangers and pilgrims on earth. See, they were pilgrims. Abraham, Isaac were pilgrims. They were all looking for a city, which builder and maker was God. And then in verse 10, it says that Jacob, again, it says that Jacob, he blessed Pharaoh and went out from Pharaoh. He went out before Pharaoh. And Joseph placed his father and his brethren and gave them a possession in the land of Egypt, in the best land, in the land of Ramses, as Pharaoh had commanded. Now Jacob, he blessed Pharaoh, and he went out from him. And Joseph then located his family in Egypt, to the best lands, which is the land of the Ramses. Now this is where the children of Israel are going to abode. This is the land of the Ramses. And they stayed here and multiplied for 430 years later. And as he stated in Exodus 12 verses 37, it says, and the children of Israel sojourned from Ramses to Sukkot, about 600,000 on foot, that were men beside the children. You see, they stayed in this land of Ramses. It's also in the province where Goshen is. This is Goshen, but they stayed in this place, in the land of the Ramses. And in verse 12 it says, and Joseph nourished his father and his brethren and all his father's household with bread according to their families. And Joseph here nourished his family with bread. And had Joseph been in Canaan, notice, had Joseph been in Canaan, all would have perished, because this is the man that God has raised. This was God's, providence of using Joseph to save the lives of his family, his household and Israel. So this is the hand of God now is in actual time here, blessing the 12 tribes of Israel, and this is nourishing them with bread. See, and this is where Joseph. This is what God intended when he sent Joseph out from Canaan to be, a slave, to come down to Egypt. And now this is what is happening here. God is now protecting these families in these terrible times of famine. And this is what's happening, but the external parts, the outsiders, this is in verse 13, this is what's happening to those in the outside. You will see that they are not, getting nourished by bread. They are almost doing everything to earn bread. You see, that's what the outside world is. They're doing everything to earn this, to have all these things. But God is freely nourishing his people. Again, you will see that the contrast here in verse 13. It says, and there was no bread in all the land, for the famine was very sore, so that the land of Egypt and all the land of Canaan fainted by the reason of the famine. See, people on the outside, all of them died, fainted. But in God's house, Joseph is God is nourishing the Israelites. You see, he's taking care of his people and nourishing them with bread, with family. But outside those who are not in faith, God is, these people fainted by the reason of the famine. You see, no bread in that land, and the famine was so sore and terrible, and the effect of famine was grievous to the people, the Egyptians, and all the outside people who are not believers. See, people who are not a people of God. But Joseph is nourishing his father and his brethren and all the father's household with bread. And again, the famine has now reached and has penetrated into Egypt, and is now an international crisis. And for the most parts of Egypt, and Joseph interpreted to Pharaoh in Genesis 41 verse 31, he says, and there shall rise after them 7 years of famine, and all the plenty shall be forgotten in the land of Egypt, and the famine shall consume the land. You see, the famine, it says that famine is the 7 years of prosperity nobody cares about is going to be consumed. It's going to be evaporate. But now the famine is going to consume everything completely. Everything in Egypt. And the famine is now consuming everything in the land of Egypt. The famine is now coming into Egypt and just basically taking over everything. And there's no food to eat at all for anybody. And here you have in verse 14, it says, and Joseph gathered up all the money that was found in the land of Egypt and in the land of Canaan for the corn which they bought. And Joseph brought the money into Pharaoh's house. And he says that now everything that was in the store, remember Joseph put everything in the storehouse in Egypt. And he did it beforehand. For 7 years of surplus, he gathered all these huge corn, and basically he picked up all the corn in the land and put it in Pharaoh's storehouse and stored them away. And now this famine is now coming in, and everything. It says that Joseph gathered all the money. People are now buying, and Joseph now selling these people corn, and in the house of Pharaoh. And it says, and when the money failed in the land of Egypt and in the land of Canaan, all the Egyptians came unto Joseph and said, give us bread, for why should we die in thy presence? For the money faileth. And Joseph said, give your cattle, and I will give you for your cattle if money fail. Now, when money failed, the next thing, these people couldn't trade, so they asked for handouts. And he said, give us bread. And they are no longer dependent. They lost that dependency, and again, the money failed, meaning inflation. And the food is now becoming a high commodity than money. And Joseph says, give me your cattle now. I will give you food for your cattle. And Joseph is still upholding the dignity by, making them give up something. You see, rather than for them taking handouts. And again, the Egyptians were traders by occupation. So to maintain their dignity, they will have to trade. And it is a sin to be able to give able-bodied man or person handouts, you see, without work. And they have cattle, and these people have cattle, and they're wearing shepherds, but they had cattle, and it says, and they brought their cattle unto Joseph, and Joseph gave them bread in exchange for horses and for flocks and for the cattle of the herds and for the asses, and he fed them with bread for all their cattle for that year. Again, it says they gave them cattle for bread and for horses for bread, and this is the exchange of capitalism. You see why? Again, this is to uphold their dignity and the properties for the bread for that year. He gave them properties and then he gave them bread for that year. They gave Joseph their properties, and then Joseph gave him bread for the year. And he says, and when that year was ended, they came unto him the second year and said unto him, we will not hide it from my Lord, how that our money is spent. My Lord also had our herds of cattle. There is not aught left in the sight of my Lord, but our bodies and our lands. Again, all things have gone now. Everything has finished. Everything, bread, everything. They have no more properties to sell. But for the bodies, the only thing they have is their bodies and the land. Again, it says in verse 19, it says, he's going to say, and in 19 it says, all these now, they want to sell themselves now. You see, they want to sell themselves, and they want to sell themselves to Pharaoh. They want to offer themselves to Pharaoh. But moving on in verse 20, it says, and Joseph bought all the land of Egypt for Pharaoh, for the Egyptians sold every man his field, because the famine prevailed over them. So the land became Pharaoh's. Again, Joseph bought all their lands now, because remember, they had their bodies and their lands. That's the only thing they have to offer. But Joseph now buys up all their land. And it says here, and in verse 21, it says, and as for the people, he removed them to cities from one end of the borders of the Egypt, even to the other end thereof. You see, for the people, he removed them from one end of the city to another city and brought them closer to where the bread was. You see, he brought them closer. And here in verse 22, he says, and only the land of the priests bought he not, for the priest had no a portion assigned them of Pharaoh, and did eat their portion which Pharaoh gave them. Wherefore they sold not their lands. See, only the priests, for the Egyptian priests, Joseph did not buy their lands, He left them alone because the priest had a portion which Pharaoh had given them, and only the priest he did not sell, but for others he did. And he says, and then Joseph said unto the people, behold, I have bought you this day and your land for Pharaoh. Lo, here is seed for you, and ye shall sow the land. See, Joseph to the people, he said, I bought all the things from you. I bought everything from you. But again, here is the seed for you. Now, Joseph is now giving them seed. You see, he didn't just take them, all of them, and made them slavery and made them captive. And made them bond slaves. You see, he gave them seed for them to sow so they can continue trading. And he says in verse 24, he says, and it shall come to pass in the increase that ye shall give the fifth part unto Pharaoh, and 4 parts shall be your own, for seed of the field, and for your food, and for them of your household, and for food of your little ones. You see, he said, give the fifth part to Pharaoh, and then take the fourth. This is capitalism, you see. You know, despite owning all, Joseph owns all now. Joseph, he refused to give them free lunch now, or he refused to take them as captives. But here he offered them work and opportunity. You see, you know, he could have taken them as slaves, but rather he gave them a seed to sow. And he says in verse 25, it says, and they said, thou hast saved our lives. You see, he uphold their dignity now. He says, let us find grace in the sight of my Lord, and we will be Pharaoh's servants. Now he says, these people say that you have saved our lives here. You know, they offered them before to become slaves. And he says, these people have nothing else to give, but Joseph is still maintaining their dignity. And in verse 26 it says, and Joseph made it a law over the land of Egypt unto this day, that Pharaoh should have the fifth part, except the land of the priest only, which became not Pharaoh's. Again, he made it a law that Pharaoh is going to have his fifth part to be able to sustain the people and trade. You know, Pharaoh, you know, could have owned everything, again, including the people, and they were to sell themselves, everyone except the priest, and the priests were given a portion to Pharaoh. But Joseph didn't want to make slaves out of these people, and again, to keep the economy balanced, so for the people to have something to give back. And Joseph is a master of economics, and he's to sustain work, you know, to sustain the people. You know, they must have to continue to work and not receive handouts. They are supposed to continue to work, and Joseph will prevent them from getting handouts or being sold into bondage. And in verse 28 it says, and Israel dwelt in the land of Egypt in the country of Goshen, and they had possessions therein, and grew and multiplied exceedingly. Again, keep in mind that Abrahamic blessing is not subject to the world economic. And despite the famine that is happening in Egypt, you see here God's people were still growing and increasing. And we need to understand there is two economic on this earth. We have the world economic. You know, the world looks at the economic system and cries out and screams and say, hey, you know, the world is collapsing. But there's an Abrahamic blessing. You know, this is God's economic way of using and protecting his people and nourishing and taking care of his people. But you can see the contrast here. What is going on the outside in the world does not affect God's people. You see, despite all these things that are happening in Egyptians, you see, Israel, it says in verse 28 that Israel dwelt in the land of Egypt, in the country of Goshen, and they had possessions. See, they had possessions therein, and grew and multiply exceedingly. See, this is God's blessing. This is God's economic system, and this is Abrahamic blessing in effect, in full force, in effect, in a broad scale. And we should keep our mind on this thing, especially as a believer. See, that everything that happens on the outside does not affect the believers. But again, in verse 28, it says, and Jacob lived in the land of Egypt 17 years, as to the whole age of Jacob was 147 years. Again, Jacob lived in the land of Goshen until he was 147 years. Again, when he came into Egypt, he was 130, but now he lived throughout. He lived for another 17 years in Egypt. And here it says in verse 29, and the time drew nigh that Israel must die. And he called his son Joseph and said unto him, if now I have found grace in thy sight, put, I pray thee, thy hand on my thigh, and deal kindly and truly with me. Bury me not, I pray thee, in Egypt. See, he called him, Jacob is now called Israel. And he knew that his time in Egypt is coming to a short time. So he called his son Joseph, and so he requested not to be buried in Egypt, but he swore. This is again what Abraham did to Eliezer. He said, put your hand on my thigh. In other words, to swear an oath. This is the way of swearing. Swearing an oath means put your hand under my thigh. So to swear an oath. And here Jacob is putting his son to swear an oath concerning his burial arrangement. And then in verse 30 it says, but I will lie with my fathers, and thou shalt carry me out of Egypt, and bury me in thy burying place. And he said, I will do as thou. Joseph says, I will do as thou said. And he said, swear unto me. And he sware unto him. And Israel bowed himself upon the bed's head. You see, now he has received the oath of his son that he will not be buried in Egypt, but to be buried with his father Abraham, Isaac, in the cave of Machpelah. You see, near Mamre, and this is where Abraham's body lay. This is where Abraham and Sarah and Isaac, this is their body. This is where Rebecca, all these people were buried in this place. But this is where the patriarchs were to be buried, because they are waiting for the resurrection, you see. And they are going to be resurrected in that land. So now this is where he's making sure that his son understood what is taking place. And when his son Joseph said, I will do that, the oath again is the oath is not something like we say today in the words of agreement and just say, okay, I will do this or do. No, the oath means that unless that oath is not fulfilled, the person who swore it is still bound by it. So Jacob now passes this oath to his son, and then he said that after that he bowed himself to his head. He said he rested. And again, he says swearing is not just words, you see. And this is a very big deal here that just took place. A very big deal between the father and the son. So we're going to continue here, and we're going to start again in Genesis chapter 48. But until then, precious saints, God bless.